this is Tim. He's one of the best. I can just say that. And I say that because he's brilliant, and he's one of my most constructive critics over my career, which I really appreciate. Keeps journalists on their toes, which is what it should all be about. So Tim has a lot to work off of what Bill has had said when he started his career in 1990 at UWM. Early on, that idea of community building and working with his students and going out into watersheds and working on remediation. That sense of community building became fundamental to what he does. So he is now the William Collins Kohler Chair Emeritus of the Systems Change and Peace Building program at UWM, and he co-founded that program. They are drawing students from around the world, not just from around the state. And so again, that idea of science and peace building is fundamental. Is that enough said, or should I keep going?
Just you can stop right there.
Okay, I'll stop right there.
I'm not just your biggest, best critic, but I'm also your big supporter too.
No, I mean, it's all so important. It's great you're all here. Tim will have a lot to say to take the conversation further, and then we'll have time for your questions.
Thank you. Boy, this was the wonderful morning listening to you, Bill and Melissa. I'm going to look right up there at the thing on the wall, because I was staring at that during the meetings. I think that's my introduction to my conclusion right there. And just say, put in, for environmental sustainability, water policy, and everything we do, personal relationships grounded on uncompromising values built from a foundation of trust, integrity, and respect. And how do we do that? And that's really what this talk's going to be about. I want to mention that I'm going to diverge a little bit from some of the stuff I have on there, so I may skip through some slides. Those of you online, I can, hopefully that won't be too dizzying for you. I want to kind of put this in perspective of how my positionality coming into this talk. As Susan mentioned, I'm emeritus, which my daughter just happened this last month. Basically means I'm retiring, or I'm going into what I call preferment. I can do the things now that I want to do. My daughter refers to it as having the golden handcuffs of the university removed. But what it does, it provides me the opportunity to reflect a little bit on things that I've done over the 32 years at UWM and before. So today I'm going to be kind of pulling together a lot of different thoughts, some of them organic, some of them I'm just developing here as we talk, as an emergent conversation with you, kind of practice what I try to preach. So if you're so moved during my talk to sort of, I have to ask this question now, please do. I won't be offended by that. I want to feed off your energy. Because that's one of the real principles of systems change, is listen to the system, find the energy in the system, and work with that energy. Big problem with engineers. They want to control the water. Work with the water. Gravity's a law, not an option, okay? So that's going to be kind of the tone of what I'm going to try to get through this talk with you, and I think the conversation after. I want to acknowledge the serious problems we have out there. Some of them will come up in the situations I talk about, challenges with the politics, challenges with the policy, but I want to approach it from the standpoint of hopeful anticipation. I was thinking about, on the way here, a conversation I had when I first came to UW Milwaukee as a young assistant professor, just wanting to save the world. And some of you may know the name Lee Kernan, who was with fisheries for many years with the DNR. I was at one of the DNR early fisheries meetings, and I was talking about how we need to use knowledge, and we need to stop planting these exotic Pacific salmon in Lake Michigan, because we need the native species back. And Lee, in his wisdom, pulled me aside and says, Tim, you got to realize that people care about Lake Michigan because of those salmon. When we put them in there, there were dying alewives washing up on the beach. It was smelly. It was like, we don't want any part of that. And suddenly, when those big, beautiful fish came swimming up the river, and people found out they were toxic waste and they couldn't eat them, suddenly that shifted the system. Suddenly the people started rallying around. They went to the politicians, we got to do something. He said that set the stage for what we call now nonlinear change, a window of opportunity that you have to be aware of, and when that window opens, you have to be ready to act. So I think one of the lessons is, change is not linear. It happens in spurts. That's kind of my evolutionary background. I'm an evolutionary biologist by training, who then sort of got involved, as Susan said, into restoration. I realized through the restoration work that my successful restorations had less to do with the cutting edge science that I did, which I don't downvalue that, but it had to do with just how much community we built around the project so that the community continue to learn and adapt and make the project successful. And that is one of these, again, based upon how do you build community around these things, what do you do at large scale, small scales, and lower scales. So I also want to acknowledge in my reflection on this, sort of where I come from, acknowledge my dad, sort of the philosophical approach I take in looking at my projects. He used to say, there are two kinds of people, Tim. People who think there are two kinds of people and those who don't. And that's true. But it got me saying, facts are not relative. I'm not sort of a Trumpist saying, okay, alternative facts. I'm saying, we have to recognize that facts depend a little bit on how we define. We take observations, but then we create information based upon the questions we ask of that. And it goes on, he said, related to that, Tim, there are saints and saint makers. He'd oftentimes that I'm the saint, he'd say I'm the saint maker. But the whole thing is that good and evil, bad, good, who's on the right side, who's on the wrong side, kind of depends on your perspective. And I think to that extent was encouraged through my dad to not necessarily go in thinking I'm right, but being recognized that who's the saint and saint maker depends upon which side of the aisle you sit on, where you are in terms of age, where you are in terms of socioeconomic status. But I also really need to recognize my mom. My dad was much more of an empiricist. He was a machinist. He was mechanistic. He would build things up deductively from small pieces to wholes. My mom was very different. She was very much a mystic, very much inductive. She would look at patterns, and she would always be asking why, and she would say, Tim, finding answers is easy. Don't focus on finding the answers. Ask yourself if you're asking the right question, because we oftentimes are finding answers to things that really. It's not that it's not good to find answers. We need to do that, but I think when we're dealing with these really complex problems, we need to keep asking ourselves: is that the right question to be asking? And then and then my mom was also. I was the 8th of 10 children, and one of the things that was really valuable was before my mom passed away, I was able to sit with her and tell her that the most important thing I use in my professional life is what I learned being the 8th of 10 kids around her dinner table. And that was that you don't get your way by sort of trying to convince people that you're right, but by engaging in the conversation around your differences. And she was a real fan of M. Scott Peck. Some of you may know M. Scott Peck, a psychologist, family therapist. And I think this was one of his quotes, I think in one of his books. Might be The Road Less Traveled or People of the Lie. I've never been able to find the quote, but my mom would always say, Tim, it takes friction to make a smooth surface. Engage it creatively, not productively. Now, this may sound really idealistic, okay? It is. But you know what? I'm going to talk to you today about how do you take that idealism and how do you operationalize it in different ways that we can, I'm not saying we're going to bridge these gaps here, okay, but at least we can begin to reclaim some of that middle ground that's been lost over the last 15 years or so, okay? So let's be realistic about it, but at the same time, I want to think that my grandkids are going to have something a little different than what we've been facing right now. So you can go from there. I've been very fortunate, and Susan helped me with the time here to make sure, because I'm kind of getting, I'm vamping here. I want to say that the perspective I bring is I've been very fortunate over my time in UW-Milwaukee is to be able to sort of do my work in a lot of different places. Okay, so from the Sahel in Africa, where you have this tension in water between the desert coming south and the rainforest and moving to the north, and challenges around conflict between very different lifestyles, between the herders who are used to moving and adapting to changing water in the environment, and the farmers, the agriculturalists who face down. Okay, and then we have the colonialists come in and draw lines, and suddenly you have a political system that does not match the water system, which does not match the cultural system. So recognizing that around the world, one of the biggest problems we have, as discussed, which we'll come back to hopefully, is that we have, as human beings, made decisions that disconnect us from who we are, from our culture, from our society, from each other, and disconnected us from the environment. So we're not able to make decisions at the right scale, at the right time, whatever. So, you know, whether you're talking about sort of biodiversity in Lake Victoria, whether you're talking in invasive species, whether you're talking about water conflict in agriculture up at Lake Turkana, whether you're talking about, and some of you have seen the bonobo exhibit at the Milwaukee Zoo in the Congo, where you have the conflict between indigenous rights and conservation. These are problems that are happening around the world related to water, related to people. I'm also very lucky to have worked for many years and continuing now in Southeast Europe along the Black Sea, Romania, Ukraine, the Danube Delta, on challenges related to, say, sturgeon and fish migration through up the Danube River, up all the way from Romania up through Germany and the Balkans, and water conflict transboundary. And in these cases, you have this long history, and you recognize that the problems that we're working on today are emergent from issues that have been going on for a long time. And that if we focus too much on the symptom that we're observing today, we may patch a moment, but we will not actually deal, the problem will keep recurring. This is one of the, why we call this sustainable peace building, is we don't just try to resolve the existing conflict, but we try to understand what's the system within which that conflict is occurring. Now the program, I don't know if you know this, Susan, but the program that we started in Sustainable Peace Building, we couldn't find a home in the university for it, because we bring in students from so many different backgrounds. It's a disruptive program to traditional academia, because we create students that are specialists in being a generalist, which kind of goes against the specialization theme that say, you know, if you want to get a job, you got to be a specialist. We're saying if you want to be effective, you have to learn how to talk the language across the disciplines, so you can actually deal with some of the things that you have to deal with, right, Bill? All right. So when we found out, we found our home. I don't know if any of you are nurses, but we found our home at the College of Nursing, because nurses look at health as more than the absence of disease. Sustainable peace building looks at peace as more than the absence of conflict. And from here, I want to say we have to look at sustainability and our water resources as more than the absence of degradation. If we just focus on eliminating degradation, the negative aspect, we have to do that at the same time as building what are the positive things that build it. So it's both, it's balancing policy that both, what do you say, you know, decreases the normalization of degradation, but also increases the positive things that build community, build trust, build respect, build the things that allow the system to be healthy. So it's a systems-based approach. And then also here in Wisconsin, where I've gotten to know, like on Central Sands with Pleasant Lake, I got to work with a number of you here on issues of water conflict and sustainability, everything. I was going to take this ice mountain, and I was going to take a drink, and then I said, yeah, I worked on the Nestle Perrier project over in Adams County, and I'm looking at this right now, and one of the, when I got involved in that, I don't know, did we ever talk about this much, Susan? Yeah. I was kind of asked to be part of this to sort of mitigate and negotiate the permitting of that. And I can say this now that I'm no longer a state employee. My golden handcuffs are off. Colleagues in the DNR said, Tim, we need you to come in as an expert to help slow this down. Slow it down, because we don't have the policies, laws in place to regulate this. So we entered into a very good process to just really say, okay, let's see this down. And eventually Nestle, Perrier, they did get their permit, but they decided, you know what, this is too complex, we're going to move to Michigan. So proudly sourced in Michigan, because we were successful in Wisconsin. Now, did we fix the problem here? Well, we stopped the symptom, but then it emerges someplace else. So I'll let somebody else drink that. And my coffee. All right. So yeah. So anyway, so before I start, I want to get specific here to talk about Wisconsin. I'm going to talk a lot about an example that touches on what Melissa talked about with the public trust, what you talked on about in terms of how the DNR has been disemboweled in its ability to basically take a progressive and effective step. And I meant those two words here, okay, so if this is being recorded, if the DNR hears this, I'm on your side on this. But to really, now I forgot what I was going to say. To really get at how do we engage productively lessons from the past, and how do we kind of use that to understand how we can sort of build a better set of interactions and systems and policies going forward. So based upon sort of, again, well, let me think about this. A lot of talks will come and throw a lot of knowledge at you and expect you to take knowledge. And for much of my career, I've been generating and transmitting knowledge to my students. Now in my new role, I'm going to try to focus more on, or less on generating and creating knowledge, but more like harvesting wisdom. You know, what's the difference between knowledge and wisdom? One of my students gave me a really great example. Knowledge is knowing tomatoes are fruit. Wisdom is knowing not to put it in your fruit salad. Okay, so it's how do we use the knowledge? So I'm going to try to harvest some knowledge from these experiences, and then say where can we use that wisdom in going forward. So these are my conclusions to the talk. So look for these as I go through the case example of the Pike River. First of all, I call this the bottom line up front, the bluff slide. There are multiple realities, diverse perspectives. My truth is not your truth. My reality is not your reality. And as part of that is recognizing, as my dad would say, you know, to you I might be a saint maker. You know, you might be a saint maker to me. I mean, the point is that we do have these different perspectives. And as part of that, get out of the mindset that I have the truth and embrace intellectual humility. As a evolutionary fish ecologist going into a college of nursing, where I was not only a non-nurse, but also the only man on the executive committee, you have to embrace the intellectual humility that, you know what, I don't know things, you know, and be willing to say, yeah, you know, I'm not the expert on this. And then through that, foster a culture of exchange and dialogue. I really want to learn about what I don't know from you. Okay? And that's hard for us to do as human beings. It's not rewarded. The second, and I think this is really the key that I'd like to focus on that relates to what, I can't read the first, is that William or somebody say? Thanks a lot for the lead-in. It is focus on legitimacy of the process, not the product. We tend to reward ourselves for really good products. Man, I did a great restoration, a noun. But the verb part of it, how do we actually focus on the legitimacy of the process rather than an effective, rewarded product? That's hard. And through that, we'll talk a lot about mental models. What do we consider to be the reality we deal with? Cultivate collaborative partnerships that build trust and prioritize community ownership. That's all about that legitimacy that was talked about earlier. And then this is key, and I think this is where we have to kind of build hope in terms of moving forward, is that what the world changes, okay? We are living in a very dynamic world. I kind of don't like, from one perspective, to talk about sort of sustainability and natural balance in Lake Michigan. Because, you know, it really wasn't there 6,000 years ago, and probably is not going to be there 6,000 years from now. You know, we have to recognize that we're part of a very dynamic and changing world, and that what we value and what we call, you know, our mental models will shift over time, and that we need to be able to continuously adapt and use monitoring, evaluation, learning as part of just our basic culture. Things will not stay the same, and we have to continually adapt. It's not plan and stick to the plan, it's plan to adapt. And this gets back, I think, to the example I'll talk about, and certainly to the Perrier example as well. Once you think you've succeeded, you failed. I hate to say that, but it really kind of is. You know, this is a continuous process, okay? Just like Lee Kern, and the other thing he said to me is he said, you know, some things just only change between a combination of mortality and retirement. Some change is intergenerational. And you both look at that as like, oh man, I'm not going to be able to change things. Or you can say, you know what, I can set the stage for the next generation. And you know, I think as an educator, as a policymaker, I think that's one of the real things we have to recognize, is that things do change and we have to be ready for that. So the take-home message is, again, back up to that, is through the process of community building, we have to balance between expert knowledge and knowledge equity. Finding places within the program, policy, project cycle to bring people into the table, to bring them in, to get their value, get their input, and find a place to use their knowledge. It may not be in designing a wetland. It may not be in dealing with toxic chemicals. It may not be with shore erosion, but it might be with other parts of the system. Bring people in and let them know you value the knowledge they bring in, okay? Because it's their reality, and their reality has to be valued. The second is that prescriptive solutions can be very effective in the short term until things change. And if you value and you work on a participatory emergent process, that tends to be effective in the long term. Which brings me to the last point on the bottom there, the balance between, there's an old African proverb, some of you have probably heard, if you want to go fast, travel alone. If you want to travel far, go together. Okay, and that's one of the balances we have to place. Is this urgent? Do we need to get this done now? Or is it emergent? Is it something that we have to engage in a longer term process? I do a bit of consulting work and with a number of boards of directors. That's where a lot of the conflict arises within boards of directors. Some people want to just, let's get this done quick and move on because they're time constrained, and others who are more engaged in the larger community process are saying, well, we need to look at all these larger term issues. Having people who could balance that is really unique. If you find them, cultivate them, because that's what we need to be ready for when those windows of opportunity occur for a project to really take off. Okay, so I'm close to my 30 minutes here, so what I want to do is really quickly get into the Pike River and make some of these points, and we can go through the discussion in Q&A about them. The Pike River was an agricultural watershed that was ditched and created by steam shovels back in the 1800s, which turned basically a wet mesic prairie into a drainage ditch that coalesced into what's now called the Pike River. Now, there was a river there before, but you basically, through agricultural development, it became what we call the Pike River. And with that then, that economic development based upon the agriculture system led to a lot of development through Racine, Mount Pleasant, and that development led to some really large growth in non-permeable, impermeable surfaces, which then led to a lot of flooding problems. Very common sort of thing that happens, urban sprawl development leads to flooding. That flooding created a significant challenge for Mount Pleasant, and Mount Pleasant, working with the Southeast Wisconsin Regional Planning Commission, came up with a flood control plan, which eventually led to the Pike River Restoration Project, which was a 20-plus year project that I was involved in. Now, the Pike River Project is held up as a great example of restoration. But you know what? It wasn't simple, because there was conflict, there was disagreement, there was court cases, there were Supreme Court cases, there was all these things, but we eventually, over 20 years, got to this really great project. It's really successful. It's now, it went from beginning, you know, Mount Pleasant now is so excited about it. They have these trails, they have this incredible green corridor, which was a drainage ditch 20 years ago that was flooding. And if you just look at the end now and say, Mom, this is great, let's do it here, let's do it here, let's do this other places. Well, you know what? We can't. What we did back then can't be done today. Now it could, and maybe we can going forward, but right as today we can't. What Pike River did is they basically had population growth, as I mentioned before, leading to flood hazards. That flood hazards, they put together a plan to create flood storage and channel modifications. The DNR turned down that plan because it violated the public trust. They went to facilitation and decided, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to create wetlands, create fish habitat, and prairie restoration. So that was the plan that came out of the conflict. which I'll show you. You can read more, and I'll show you a place where you can learn more about that. But what happened was the process that was put in place to get to that plan to permit created an emergent structure that allowed the community to continue to participate and imagine and dream the Pike River to be something more than what it was. The policy at that time allowed for that process to be put in place to legitimize the process, where then the community engagement cultivated and precipitated a much more emergent ecosystem, goods and resources, where suddenly we started to see the Pike River create recreational opportunities, cultural opportunities, and economic opportunities. Things like the prairie restoration and biodiversity created education opportunities. People started using it for education. They then put a trail corridor in around it, so more people started going around the trails. That led to the development of the Pike River Parkway, which the village then really said, wow, we've got this great asset. Suddenly politicians who were against it because people were afraid that the trails were going to bring undesirable people into their backyards, or that the prairie was going to produce weeds that were going to be all over their garden. They started to see it as, they flipped it from a negative to a positive. Again, these are these windows of opportunity. You get that mental model shift from a ditch to a river to a prairie to a green corridor, from a green corridor to recreational opportunities. Suddenly the mental models of the community have shifted, where they took ownership, and you suddenly then get community attractiveness, people are advertising for it, property values near it go up, private-public partnerships form, businesses in the area start saying, wow, we've got all this great trail system that leads right up to our business. We can use this to recruit talent because people in Chicago want to be able to go out and run or bike on their breaks. They want to be able to take their bikes to work. So Case New Holland is like really supporting this at all. So you've got this. We could not have planned this and prescriptively put it in place, but the early process of conflict, and this is where I credit my mom, if you embrace that friction at that early stage as something that can put a process in place that gives the community the opportunity to create new things, you take, how do you say, I want to say you take it out of the DNR's hands. I don't want to say we want to take things out of the DNR's hands, but you shift the power to the people who can then use that power to facilitate things that are positive for the environment, positive for the community. Now, there are caveats to that, and you have to be wary about problems. So I'm going to skip to my conclusions here, and I'll make available, if you want to learn more about the details of what happened during that process, it's in a paper that just came out with my former student, Andy McGuire, called Restoration as Social-Ecological Transformation, Emergence in the Pike River Watershed, where in that paper, and this is sort of a diagram for the paper, which I won't go through, but it lays out the timeline of what had to happen between the initial flooding, the permit denial. The Chapter 30 permit that Melissa talked about was so important. That created the convening context where people had to come together. And there's key people at these different times that played super important roles. Peter Peshek, some of you may recognize that name from public convener, who then went into other issues. But as the attorney, he played the bridger role that says, you know what, Mount Pleasant, you don't want to go to the Supreme Court. You want to go into a facilitation. And he's the one who contacted me, and he said, Professor Ehlinger, you need to come here and help to develop a language so that the village people can learn how to talk to the DNR in language that he felt they really want the same thing. Their interests are the same. They just have different ways they want to get to it. So I'm not taking credit for that, but Peter was the one who said, let's bring these people together, which created this facilitation, a year-long facilitation, which took a lot of energy. But basically people like Mike Kane, Mike Luba, a lot of the big DNR people came together in that, which then led to a legitimacy of a process, which then put in place a design phase, which brought people in to say, what can we imagine the Pike River to be? And then an implementation and learning phase that went for 18 years. We got a 20-year Chapter 30 permit. That would not happen today, because they said, okay, we're going to build into it a learning process where we don't know what you're going to do in phase 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9, but we're going to incorporate kind of a learning phase that we have to kind of review it. We don't have to approve it, but we need to review it. at every one of those phases. So that was what built trust in the system and allowed it to work. So just to give you an idea of some of the things, these are some of the people that were part of that that were really important. You might know some of these names: Sue Schumacher, Bob Beeble, Don Reed, a big wetland person throughout here, engineering partners and things of that sort. So as part of that facilitation, a couple of things I want to point out that were really important is what is the public trust, as Melissa was talking about earlier. Is the pike a living river or a drainage ditch? That mental model shift had to be negotiated. There was a real concern by Mike Kane that if we fix this river, it's going to basically set and stage more urban sprawl. That's the two-edged sword of restoration work. And I wrestle with this a lot with restoration work. If I restore a stream, oh, that's great, I restored the stream. But also, it says, oh, gosh, if I damage the stream, I can restore it. You know, does it lessen the resistance to doing bad things because you know you can fix it? And one of the other things was is the river healing or dying? So let me just bump ahead here a little bit. The conceptual design, and this was what was really important, and this is where I think a policy domain comes into play here, is that at that time the DNR was in the water basin mode, and they had integrated water management was going on, and it allowed the DNR and their basin management team to approve this permit based upon just conceptual designs, basically imagining what it would be like. But in the permit then, incorporate this 50, 90, 100% approval process for each of the 9 phases. And there's some language in here. The DNR was in a transitional mode between its historical water regulation and zoning and the watershed management program, which is basin management. So this was back in the late 90s, okay, which made this process possible. But then it went through the assembly of that, which was the divide and conquer. And the project that basically went through in these 9 phases, it's been very effective. It's been handling several 500-year flood events. It's been really successful in restoring biodiversity in the stream. It's been very effective in wetland creation, and it's been held out as a real model for how to restore a watershed and how to engage the community as part of that restoration work. The things that the paper makes again, this paper makes that I'll make available for you, or you can just Google it and find it. It was possible because we had really key systems change leaders, people who said, okay, we can look at how these things all connect, and they play very different roles in different contexts. We talk about having the right people at the table. It also means you want to not have the wrong people. We want to be inclusive, but there are certain types of people that want to make things very simple. Okay? Let's keep this simple. Let's make our boundaries and focus on the problem. Focusing on the problem will not result in really long-term successful environmental projects. You've got to look at how that problem is emergent from underlying human, social, ecological conditions. All right? You have to, as I mentioned before, be willing to listen for and be ready for paradigm shifts and take advantage of those opportunities. The willingness of Mount Pleasant to shift their mindset from tax and land development to water management, to shift from water management to ecosystem management. There's just these things the system leaders have to be aware of those, and through that, at every point in time, encourage that we are not experts. We are all learning through this process. Create that culture of learning. And from the standpoint of this conference, we have to talk about and figure out how we can create a policy environment that allows for these kind of integrated approaches. One of the things that came out of some of these early restoration projects of mine was the awareness that the governor at the time, who was really into building highways, was using some of the ways our restoration projects slowed down projects, like highway projects. These emergent processes don't go fast. So what happens is you get this argument, well, we need to provide policies that allow for regulatory certainty. Right? You're laughing about that. You've heard that before. We need regulatory certainty. Bullshit. I'm sorry. We don't know enough about these things to know these. We have to be able to take the opportunity to say we have a greater responsibility to ensure that what you're doing gets connected. We're not saying you can't do what you're doing, but we need to be able to find a way to do it where we balance. We talk about this balancing test. I've been in a lot of contested case hearings, and what the examiner is there to hear for is, has the DNR applied the balancing test? We need to get back to that point where we have the time to really look at the balancing between all of these portions. So lastly, as a cautionary tale, back to the one about when you think you've been successful, you failed. Pike River is a great example of that. Okay. We've all heard of Foxconn. I'm not going to get into the politics and policy of Foxconn, but basically that's in the Pike River watershed, and that disturbance in the system basically established a opportunity for development where now Racine has run a major water pipeline down the Pike River corridor right through our restoration work. They fixed it, but they dug the hole and they filled it up and replanted stuff on top of it, so you can't see what they did. But ran a pipeline, and how much is it, 7 million gallons a day, I think, something like that. It can take like half the amount as the city of Waukesha. Okay, they're not using like any of that right now because they don't need it right now. They don't need the space right now. They don't need the jobs right now. They don't need to manufacture anything there right now. But what they will need in the coming years is a place where they can do that because there's water. So it's basically preemptive development on the case of Foxconn. So they've got everything they need, not for now, not for the 13,000 jobs they should have created, but that's, again, these are the disturbances in social ecological systems that we have to be aware of. So when I look at the Pike River as this emergent set of great things and people say, oh man, let's do this, it's like, well, there's a feedback loop here, and suddenly we got to be aware that just as much as we can talk as emergence, we can talk about degradation and devolution. And that's where I think I want to kind of leave it there and say thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we have a few minutes for questions. I wonder if anybody has questions that have come out since, during Tim's presentation, if you want to ask that first. And I can bring a mic back to you. Anybody have questions or thoughts based on this last whirlwind of, what would you call it? Thought-provoking. I mean, it's fabulous.
My brain, no.
No. Anything? Yeah. Should I?
You should be able to be picked up as long as you're in front of the room.
Just a question about about the watersheds that you were talking about. How do you integrate when you look at for instance, in your map? Are there areas where the watersheds overlap, and how do you bring in diverse? If there are rivers, for instance, that kind of flow between watersheds or draining off that, how do you bring in those subgroups? I guess.
Talk to me in 6 or 7 months after my team has had a little bit more. But it's another reason why we picked the central Wisconsin basin is because the Wisconsin River flows through that entire basin. So, and as Tim was saying, there's a bunch of different ways that you can look at that. One of them is kind of more mechanistic in terms of we have a rough idea in any given year how much water is coming from the upper Wisconsin basin into the central Wisconsin basin, and similarly how much flows out the bottom. And that's one way that you can look at it. There's pollution load that comes with that and things like that. So yeah, the thing about watersheds is they are by definition nested. So, and hydrologic service has numbers and ways of dealing with them. But so the central Wisconsin basin, just going the other way, there are 29 sub-basins or watersheds within that. And to me, that level of complication, if you will, is actually useful because I don't know what's going to come out of the discussions that my team is having, but one way to think about watersheds is kind of turtles all the way down. So you could take the central Wisconsin basin, and there may be kind of precepts that you want to apply at that level, but a major part of that may be also that you want each of those 29 sub-watersheds to do their own thing, so that there'd be an element of this that is coming from kind of the smaller scale to the larger, and you set side rails to make sure that. So I think that there will be kind of a dynamic tension there, and the same thing is going to be true to some degree with like what's happening in the upper Wisconsin River and what you're sending down to the lower Wisconsin River. I don't know if that answers your question.
That's very helpful.
And if I may, that really is so important when we look at what's happening on the land surface, recognizing that with many of these small watersheds, the groundwater doesn't match the surface water. So sometimes we have groundwater being pulled out, which is taking water out of a river in a different basin, and that's a real challenge.
Other thoughts that have come up since, between these and now? Can you push that up?
Everything seems to take a long time and a lot of public involvement and all that, but it just seems like some of the rivers, like Sheboygan River, $40 million, Kinnickinnick River, $30 million, or whatever, on and on. Some very big projects seem to be happening very quickly, and I wondered how that enters in. I'm kind of the same entities are all involved with that stuff.
I've been involved with like the Fox River up in Green Bay, the Fox River PCB cleanup. I was part of that natural resource damage assessment work. When things are sometimes part of like a Superfund process, there are structural processes in place that tend to move around, especially when there's a potentially responsible party that has money on the table. So sometimes when there's someone who they can bring in to pay for it, it tends to move a little bit faster. But then those are focused on very specific fixes, like saving people from exposure to toxic chemicals. Those things are different than like what I'm talking about, which is much more ecological services and systems. When public health is involved, and you've got legal context to this, people tend to move a lot faster. Well, we like them to move faster and hopefully can.
I think we should.
It's a different government entity or something. I mean, the dams in the Milwaukee River and everything else, is that one umbrella kind of thing, or is that all by the EPA or
There are different jurisdictionals and legal processes involved with each of those. You're moving a dam, you bring in FEMA. You're doing. There's a lot of different. This is your area.
Yeah,
You talk to.
No, there are different jurisdictions. There are also different. Again, kind of to Tim's point. So one, taking a look at the Milwaukee rivers, because I'd lump all three together, or the Sheboygan. Both of those are also areas of concern under the Great Lakes. Yeah. Anyway, international work between United States and Canada. So, it kind of depends on how you define short term. Those things have been going on since they were identified as AOCs around late 1980s, early 1990s. The Fox River is also an AOC, which also, as Tim said, had the kind of benefit of being considered a Superfund site, which means that the federal law kicks in. I won't get into the details of that, but that made it easier to, that one has cost north of $1 billion, I think. So, long-term, short-term is in itself a relative thing. The other thing that I would say, though, is because of the work that was done around the area of concern, which was the toxic contamination in Milwaukee, it is the evolution, I would argue, of that work that led the city to think about, do we really want these dams? Or do we want to restore the watershed? And what does that look like? And, and as they thought about it, realized that there are some real benefits to that. And so they kind of muddled together. And again, to Tim's point, I think the AOCs started some of that discussion, and then other people were like, oh, well, while we're at it, we can, maybe this is an opportunity to do some other things as well.
Yeah, and if I may just make a comparison between the Pike River, which took a long time, and Lincoln Creek in Milwaukee. Pike River emergent ecosystem services, facilitation. A lot of people got involved in the community, a white community, middle income, Lincoln Creek, African American community. That river was not restored, it was flood proofed. Design build, there was no community engagement, so now they've got basically fences that keep people out of the restored stream, and it's just different. There's just, it's equity, okay, water equity. That's a great example of how a restoration process was lost because there was a power in place that could do it. MMSD could go in, take the money, and hire a design build company to come in and restore the stream to fix the flooding problem. And Pike River, because of Chapter 30 and because of the community, that didn't happen. It was
I think there
that-
is work now in Lincoln Creek, though, that's beginning. There is the beginnings of community around that topic, but as you said, it's taken decades. I'll ask a question here that one person asked. Lakeshore properties, here we are, tend to be owned by well-to-do, I presume, white individuals. How has the health of our Great Lakes affected underserved populations, i.e. low income, etc., people of color?
Well, you go all around the world and you have different examples. I think here in Milwaukee, yeah, there are multiple levels to that question. If you're just talking about the Great Lakes, you know, who was the mayor that basically filled in the lake bed to create, you know, Lakeshore Park? You know, there are ways that's been dealt with in the past that are not allowed today. There are severe legal issues involved with gaining public access to the lake now through private property, and I'll throw that back to you.
Yeah, again, it comes back a little bit to scale and exactly what you're looking at. Is a lot of people, when they say the Great Lakes, you know, they are referring fairly strictly to either the water body itself or the basin, and most people don't realize, particularly for the Lake Michigan basin, just how small the land area of that basin is. You know, there are places in Wisconsin where it only goes, you know, 3 to 7 miles inland. So, you know, if you're talking about the actual shoreline, yeah, a lot of that is owned by people who can afford it. But if you're looking at the tributaries into the water, into the Great Lakes, that brings in a whole bunch of other issues, and probably are more the areas where you're going to run into environmental justice concerns about, you know, whether they're restored, if they're restored, how are they restored, and both from a flooding point of view and also from a contamination point of view.
And I will credit the Environmental Protection Agency. They have developed a very, very strong and vibrant sort of social science environmental justice program that is working with a lot of the areas of concern, so that as part of the restoration projects, they deal and they specifically study what levels of access and equity and damage. And for example, up in Duluth, there's some major activities going on in the St. Louis River to engage with some of those historically racialized access and risk problems and help through the restoration process.
So a question was asked, I think Melissa touched on this, is the word grandfathered still relevant when it comes to properties too close to the water?
Yes. Is the fast answer to
Well,
that.
in DNR we say archive. Or archival rather than grandfather. Is that what you mean?
I
Probably.
don't know who asked this question.
That was my question.
Okay.
I'm just thinking as a general term, because we've always heard this grandfathered in. So if something's grandfathered, we have a lake property north, and there are some properties that are right down on the water, literally. And I know that they're too close to the 75-foot limit. So what happens if that particular property decides, let's say the septic fails, and someone's still living there, and who's going to control anyone who's too close to the water, too far down, if there are issues with that person's property?
Typically, local communities will have impervious area and structural limits on how much you can develop. If you're still within the same footprint, you can usually do whatever you want.
But I'm saying footprint that's too close to the lake.
Yeah, even if it's
Yeah, let's
if
say
it's
that
built-
property has to be condemned or torn down.
If it's torn down, then it's a whole new
Then
footprint and you have to.
it's a moot point, then you have to automatically. But if
Um,
that little guy still wants to live there and doesn't want to move, a little lady.
Well,
you
and
know.
there's also this other
talking
complicating
about myself
factor
now.
of if your neighbors are closer than that 75-foot limit, you just have to be between that. You can still be closer than 75, but if you're still behind your neighbors,
Right.
then you're not being limited by that. So
Something like that. Okay.
there's a lot of.
I just had a question. I completely agree with the participatory process, and that's actually how you gain long-term support and meaningful change. But how do you actually fundraise or maintain funding for it? Because the grant cycles are for projects, and then and they expect those products at the end. And I know those products are not going to get where we need to go, but that's still what you're rated on, and that's still what you have to package things for. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I didn't quite hear the first part of the question, but it had to do with funding.
Yeah, so basically with funding is when grants are generally set up for products.
Yeah,
So, and a certain
Okay,
timeframe.
I see.
How do you fundraise for participatory projects that have these long timelines and have to have buy-in?
I'll say read the paper, or we can talk about that. One of the key things of systems leadership that I didn't talk about is all these different roles that people have to play. And one of the critical roles in the Pike River project was what we call the leveraging role. And because what happens when you start getting this sort of organic emergence, suddenly the dreaming starts triggering people to think, oh wait, there's this agency that has this grant, or there's this foundation that does this, and suddenly you get sort of a collective action to raise money. You know, we got money from Ducks Unlimited, we got money from Isaac Walton League, Fish and Wildlife, a lot of those, in addition to a number of private foundations that said, you know what, we work for diabetes and obesity, we're going to support some of these trails. It kind of reimagines what the support is, and different people have to do that. So you have to create an environment for that, and the paper talks a little bit about that. The most important one was probably the DNR, because once we kind of, again, back to my early comment, work with the energy in the system, there are great people out there that just need to be given the opportunity to work with their passions, and they put in the time to make good things happen.
And I mean, to give you another potential example, which interestingly wouldn't be terribly difficult to do under state law. So right now, you guys are probably familiar with Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewerage District. MMSD is a very interesting entity in a lot of different ways. So you guys may or may not know, all of our big sewage treatment plants under state law are themselves municipalities. So they have taxing authority as amongst other things, which they use. They are also interesting because they are both regulated by the DNR and by EPA. They're also a regulator of everybody that feeds into their system. So they have a lot of power if they want to use it, and I would argue actually that Kevin Schaefer, who's the current executive director, has been incredibly creative, mostly in a good way, in using that authority. Well, one of the things that you could do, and it came up as I was recruiting people for the basin team, is for each one of those water management areas, you could set it up so that all of the sewage treatment plants and all of the drinking water facilities are either owned or at least operated by a single entity. And if you were to do that, it gives you a couple of things. One, and this is more true for nutrients than other things, at the scale of those basins, it would allow you to do projects where you could see cause and effect. So if what you're trying to do with nutrients, for example, is just prevent phosphorus from getting into the water to begin with, at a basin's scale, you could do projects in the upper basin and you would probably see the effect in the lower basin. But the other thing which I hadn't thought about in the current environment, the other comments that I was getting, is smaller sewage treatment plants are having a really hard time keeping staff and training staff. So if they were part of a bigger entity, that might not go away, but it might be a little bit easier. But if you set that up, like the MMSD is, so that those entities had taxing authority, then they could raise the revenue that would be needed over the long haul to address the water quality issues and to a certain extent quantity issues in that basin. That's just, that is a very rough idea, and I throw that out just as an example of, I think some of the changes in mindset that we need. I will not argue that what I have just described is a fully vetted idea, just something that came up while doing it. But it is something that I've been doing this for 35 years, and I didn't even think about that until I started having discussions with people, and they were asking me, kind of, all right, you're saying you want to create an integrated and comprehensive plan. Just how broad are you thinking? Because this is one of the things, here's some of the things I'm seeing at. And I was like, damn, there's maybe an opportunity there. So, because funding is a huge issue, and I have worked on things, over the course of my career where the DNR gets money for a grant program. It's often not enough to deal with the need statewide, and oftentimes it goes away. And local government usually is not in a position to pick it up.
This is a really important point, and one that's actually worth a whole conference in and of itself. But for example, on the Pike River, one of the big mindset shifts was that the Stormwater Utility District, which was the ones who had to deal with the Pike River as a flood, they had a mental shift to say, oh, we can use stormwater runoff money they get through runoff equivalent units as part of just check with 151, whatever the permit they have to get for that. That tax they can use, they decide we're going to use that for water quality, not just water quantity. And so they developed, so like all the maintenance and everything of that project is done through that taxing source. And then they got the parks to do the other stuff.
I think, where are you? Say something. Tom, you're not helping me. Yeah. One last question, I'm sorry, because I think people are leaving on tours.
Oh, okay. I was wondering if anyone was aware in this meeting of the proposal to divert part of the Milwaukee River in the village of Saukville and use an existing partial channel to do it. Well, that's something I just read in the local paper.
Just this week in the press.
And don't know if it's going to happen, but it's to help the flooding over the road on County Highway W. So nobody's aware of it? No? Okay.
Read the press.
Yeah, bypass channels, creating bypass channels to deal with increasing the high water things is not uncommon right now.
There was actually a channel there at one time before my time, before I was born. I don't know when it was, but it was partially there yet, but the rest of the channel was filled in by putting fly ash in there from the old power plant.
Right.
All kinds of fun.
We want to run water through that to get rid of it, right?
Yeah,
Wash it away.
right.
So it's my job to say
Thank you.
there's so many issues, there's so much passion and so much knowledge here. So I hope you have a chance to talk further with the experts. For those of you going on tours, have a glorious time. And thank you for your love of the Great Lakes and the waters in and around us. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Susan, so much again for moderating, all of you for joining us with us today in person, those of you who are with us online. Tim, Bill, obviously Melissa, fantastic.